And so I guess my question to you is this: with respect to, you know, writing Dodgebomb, you had a lot of I'm really impressed with how you were able to just, you know, differentiate all the different types of personalities that come across from top to bottom, going all the way from field grades all the way down to the lower enlisted, and you just able just to basically find, you know, show like what that spectrum of personality looks like across the board. Like how are you able to just, like, you know, recall a lot of those memories from Iraq as you're you know, putting this book together?
I did keep a war diary for all my tours, so that helps to go back and reference things. But I think I just had such very visceral memories from my first tour and from these larger than life personalities, because most of them in the book are based off of real people, primarily from that first tour, but also, you know, some from later in my career. So, you know, some people may say it was very like deft characterization and writing. I think it was also just trying to remember these real personalities and people and just to describe them best instead of creating them.
Right, right. Yeah, because that way people like me, like, you know, when I read this, when I was reading about, you know, Lieutenant Colonel Gutierrez, right? Like that's a very specific, you know, there's a very specific type of field grade officer that exists in the Army who's very much like that.
Yeah.
Who it's like the amount of times I rolled my eyes just like reading about him, it was just it was no surprise to me. Like it was, I immediately thought of other people that I knew in the Army, and it just seemed like it was a bit of a mixed bag. And so like it sounds like your experience with field grade officers wasn't necessarily the best. Is that how you summarize it? Like how do you talk about that?
Yeah. As very cynically, that's how I would characterize my experience with field grades at the end of my Army career. Actually, during the time that Dodgebomb takes place, most of the field grades I run into are amazing. And you'll see there's Major McAdams, who's also based off of a colonel who's in real life, and he was phenomenal. Everything you wanted out of a field grade to support you. I would say the lackluster field grades that I sort of, you know, put into the book are more ones I encountered later, unfortunately, out west in Fort Lewis. And that's probably kind of the reason why, you know, I'm out of the Army to this day. So that cynicism kind of pervades, but, you know, made for some great story writing.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. No, that's really neat that you kept like a war diary. So when did you start doing the war diary?
War diary would be very brief. It would be date and major events. You know, we met with Sheikh, whatever today. We, you know, had to call EOD or there's indirect or something like that, whatever sort of prominent events. But as the tour goes on, you know, I start to put in notes about frustration and, you know, observations and things. So at the very least, it's just sort of a timeline. But there's some of the emotions and feelings still baked into that, which helped then for writing Dodgebomb.
Oh, that's great. But you didn't, so was it strictly something you did as an officer, or is it something you did as enlisted?
It was only as an officer. I never deployed when I was enlisted, fortunately or unfortunately. So yeah, and I just took one of those little green books that we all had, and just every day, if I had time after patrolling or whatever, and just write sort of a summation of what happened that day.
Yeah, because what's interesting is because I think, you know, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, like your 2010, 2011 deployment. That's actually when I deployed as well. So it's kind of crazy because I'm actually coming up my 10-year anniversary of coming home from that deployment this next month, or in August, I should say. And what's funny was the one thing I noticed that was kind of lacking in the book, or at least wasn't necessarily as emphasized as much as what I remember from my experience, was the incoming alarms, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's, and I point that out just because that was probably the most significant, you know, experience I have with like contact, if you will. But it sounds like you guys were, or at least the experience you had, you know, in 2008 was more, you know, kinetic operation, as I said, going out, trying to find the enemy, trying to find, you know, Al-Qaeda and Iraq and what have you, versus 2010, 2011, where it's more like, okay, we're going to rebuild Iraq. We're going to do all these projects, these payment projects.
Yeah. So think about, and you know, my similar experience is 2010, 2011, we're on FOBs, right? Whereas during the surge, troops are pushed out into the villages. So we're in COPs, we're on patrol bases. And of course, those sort of systems aren't really in effect. You know, if you get mortared, you just get mortared. So that indirect, you know, like scene I have in the beginning of the book, that's when you know, the protagonist, he's coming into a fob, and it's only really at the beginning and the end of the book are they on fobs, and the rest of the time they're on small little bases that don't have those bells and whistles
Right,
and
right.
don't tell you to duck, right?
Yeah. No, that's the thing, is that like, and that's something I noticed too, is because you didn't have fobs necessarily. You had you know, cops and what have you, and patrol bases, but it wasn't, nothing was really built up, and that was kind of like one of the talking points with like, oh, we need to build this up so Lieutenant Gutierrez can look really good, you know, to brigade command and this and that. And it's like, okay,
Yeah.
interesting. So one of the things I wanted to here's something that I noticed in the book too, is that you chose the paradigm of an armor officer, but you were a field artillery officer. So what made you decide to do that? I found that a very interesting take on your experience.
One, I think it was because as soon as when I did join the cab troop as a fire support officer, my troop commander was like, "You're cab, we're all cab. Everyone here is in cab, regardless MOS."
Yeah.
And then I thought, as an armor or a cavalry officer, for someone who is a military generalist or civilian or just doesn't really understand those nuances, we can nerd out about all, well, this is artillery and this is armor. I thought it was just a good sort of and best way for to get that general feeling of what being a combat arms officer was in Iraq. So it just works, and it was either sort of armor or infantry would make the most sense, and in effect we really were all armor officers or mechanized infantry. So that's why I went with it.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really cool. And that reminds me of just the experiences that I heard from people across the board, both Iraq and Afghanistan, where sometimes people, you know, for example, guys like us who are field artillery officers, we're sometimes plucked and say, oh, you're going to go with this rifle platoon, and you're going to be the platoon leader of that specific platoon. So, and it's kind of like, and I guess one of the lessons I got, and I'd love to hear your take on this, is that especially, well, at least the you know, my deployment 2010, 2011, you're kind of, I mean, I guess the consistent theme with being an Army officer is you're going to do whatever the Army tells you, whether it's, you know, leading a cav troop or cav platoon, what have you, or, you know, you're going to be, you know, being, you know, doing these payment projects along the way. I mean, it seems like that's something that I guess young officers in particular should be prepared to do, where there could be that possibility where, you know, you might not be doing that necessarily. You might not be doing the job that you're hoping to do, is what I mean to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also kind of the nature of counterinsurgency, right? Is that you just chase the problems you're given and figure them out the best way possible. I think now maybe the modern military is more, you know, siloed and more, you know, stricter on, okay, you're really going to be an artillery officer.
Yep.
But as you and I both know, it's just, you know, wars change all that. And at the end of the day, you're you know, an officer and combat arms, rather than I'm artillery or I'm infantry. I can't do that because that falls out of whichever category.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that was kind of the reason, part of the reason why I got out of the Army ultimately. When I did, or at least things that helped influence me to, you know, get out when I did, where it was I was with 3rd Brigade 1st Armored Division out of Fort Bliss, Texas, and there wasn't necessarily, we're supposed to go to Afghanistan to turn off the lights, is what they were saying. And so in my mind, I'm like, okay, I'm basically going to go back to do the job that I did in Iraq as a field artillery officer. I'm not liking how this sounds because I'm not going to be doing the job that I was hoping to do. And then plus, like the queue for battery command was like really long over at the brigade. So I was like, it's gonna be a long time before I get battery command. So this is probably a good time to get out. Writing is on the wall.